Welcome along, everyone. Thanks for joining me again. Hopefully, for some good advice on underwater photography techniques and also for the entertainment of seeing me fighting the technology of trying to broadcast live to the internet. So, as I've said in previous editions, if anything is going wrong technically, whether you can't hear me or you can hear me too much or that sort of thing, please get on the comments and let me know. Also, please get on the comments during the broadcast and get some questions in for me to answer after in the second half. I'm planning to be online for about 30 minutes, do about 15 minutes on the topic of split level photography, and then answer any comments and questions that come in during the broadcast. So hopefully we're up, hopefully we're running, and I shall now get on and start that talk. It's a little bit longer than the other one, so I want to whiz through this. Brittany Slade asked me to talk about split level photography, which is always a nice subject for a talk, but it's quite a big subject and hard to cover in sort of 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to whiz through some of this and probably pick up some of the things I don't mention in the questions. So keep the questions coming and we'll crack on with this. So split level photography is a very popular type of underwater photography and produces, without a doubt, really astonishing images. I think these pictures are particularly powerful because they show a view of the world that we can't really see with our own eyes. And therefore, there's kind of a magic about them. I think it's also said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, if your picture is a split level picture, it's probably worth 2,000 words. So these really are eye-catching, amazing images, and they're ones that underwater photographers really want to be able to shoot. So it's a good subject to talk about. There's no doubt they also have a really strong appeal, both with the general public, because it transports them from the world that they know into our world, but also within our world, they're certainly very eye-catching. I just had a look at these are the results from the wide-angle category in the Underwater Photographer of the Year contest last year, 2019. And 5 of the top 10 images, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are split level pictures. And the one of the bear at the end is almost a split level. So it shows that these pictures have a phenomenal appeal to many people. The question that I'm always asked about as soon as you mention split levels is underwater photographers flap about and worry about getting droplets on their dome port and it ruining the picture. And while getting rid of droplets is really important, and I'll deal with them later in the talk, actually, the main reason that most split level pictures fail and don't work is nothing to do with droplets on the dome. It's about photographers not finding the right opportunities, the right conditions, and particularly subject matter that's going to give them a really powerful image in this genre. So it's really, really worth digging those things out. This is a quote that I used in my book about split level photography, and it's a quote that I often use when talking about split level photography from David Duboulet, who is widely regarded as the absolute master of this technique. So listening to his advice is something that we should all do. And actually, if you follow him on social media, you saw he posted an absolutely stunning split level photo today from Papua New Guinea as a tribute to Max Benjamin, who sadly, the diving pioneer from PNG, who sadly died in the last few days. But yeah, it's really worth having a look at that picture. It's an absolute stunner. But his key to this is to find that subject matter that works in both halves of the frame. And that's something that I think is really important to take into the water. So it's not just about, okay, I've got something cool near the surface, now I can do a split level. You need to find interest and a visual story that crosses the two halves of the picture. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the subject matter is crossing through the boundary, but you need beauty and visual appeal in both halves of the picture. Now, sometimes that's easy to find. This is a crocodile in the shot this year in Cuba. And here, of course, the main subject is traversing the meniscus of the surface. So as a result, you have an interesting and pleasing image. And of course, there's supporting subject matter in terms of seagrass underwater and mangroves above water that complete the picture. You've got interest and a story that's worthy of telling in this split type image. I think a lot of our pictures as underwater photographers go wrong when we try splits, when we try and force a split level image onto the subject matter. Both of these pictures here, you can see that there's this story that relates the two halves of the image. There's a reason why I'm showing the salmon and the trees behind. It tells you about the time of year. It tells you about the habitat that these ocean fish have migrated up into for their spawning. The same with the shot inside the cave here. There's a reason why this is a split level image. And I think that's really important in our pictures. I think this is a picture that maybe doesn't work so well. Here, there's clearly subject matter in both halves of the frame. But actually, the fact that the two guys on the boat are not even looking at the crocodile, I think takes away from the shot. It reduces some of that reason for that narrative. And actually, in this situation here, I think the above water part is distracting from the underwater part and makes the picture less powerful. So you need both those elements working together for the picture to really work. I kind of kept this one and processed it because I can actually find this particular example quite funny, because the guys on the boat who have seen the crocodile so many times are so disinterested in this amazing animal that they're just kind of looking around and watching the world go by and having a chat and aren't interested in the crocodile. So I kind of quite like that about this shot. That's why I've kept it. The other thing I think that follows on from this is, if we want to tell a story across two halves in two worlds, as it were, we need both of those worlds to be sharp for that picture to work. And this is actually where split level photography starts to become a little bit more challenging, in that it's very easy to take a split level shot. It's hard to take a split level shot where both parts are in focus. And the reason it's hard is because it requires you using exactly the right settings in order to make that work, and the right technique. And the key to creating these hyperfocal pictures is a simple one, but if you keep this formula in your head, it will allow you to do it. And that is, you focus under the water, on the subject matter under the water, and then you shut your aperture of your camera right down to give you enough depth of field to keep the above water part sharp. How much you need to shut it down does vary a little bit by the size of your dome you're using, but more so with the size of the sensor. So full frame photographers, you need to be up around f20, f22 if you really want everything sharp above and below the surface. Crop sensor cameras, so 1.5 times crop, whether mirrorless or SLR, doesn't matter. The optics are the same. You need to be f16, f18 to have both parts sharp. And if you're on a micro four thirds camera, you've got a big dome, you can maybe get away with f16, but you're also probably good to be up around f18 because most of them have slightly smaller domes. And that will help you get everything sharp and above and below the surface. Now, when I shoot splits, I tend to do my focusing once and then leave the camera locked in that focus. So I'll use a back button or a thumb focus. I'll set a focus point in the lower half of the frame, as you can see here, frame it up, press that once, make sure it's absolutely bang on where I want it, and then won't press that again and shoot my whole series of pictures like that. I might, if suddenly the subject matter is coming a lot closer underwater, refocus again. But generally, I'll shoot with a fixed focus when shooting split levels. That means, of course, if you do try and shoot these with autofocus, obviously the autofocus is going to catch onto the surface and get confused. So using fixed focus is really important. I think the time I might break that rule is where clearly one half of the frame has absolutely key subject matter and the other half of the frame isn't really contributing in terms of much of the story. And this picture here is kind of a good example of that, in that we've got subject matter above the surface, and that subject matter being sharp and particularly freezing the movement of all those people was the prime criteria when taking this picture. So here I was willing to sacrifice focus under the water a little bit, sacrifice some depth of field, but maximize my shutter speed in order to freeze all that and keep those people sharp, because they're such an important element of this picture. So there are times when we might break the rules, but those tend to be more the exceptions. So onto the technique of how to get these shots. Now, by definition, split level photography is all shallow water photography. And when we shoot in super shallow water, we don't need to use artificial lighting. And I think the mistake that a lot of underwater photographers make is they're used to having flash guns on their camera, strobes on their camera, and when they go to do splits, they just leave them on. And the majority of time shooting splits, we can get away without using them. And that makes things a lot easier in that situation, both in terms of holding the camera and technically taking the pictures. So pictures like this are just available light only. It's relatively easy to take exposures like this. In order to get a good balance of exposure, though, we need the sun relatively high in the sky and we need the sun out. If it's cloudy, we'll get a much bigger exposure difference between above and below the surface. So I'll generally want to be out shooting this type of picture when the sun is high and the sun is out in the sky. It makes it a lot easier to get that exposure balanced. And when it is, it's relatively easy to take pictures like this. You know, you can just shoot this on auto exposure should you want to, and take the shots away. So no flash in any of these pictures. However, when there's a big exposure difference between the above water part and the underwater part, and almost always the above water part is too bright and the underwater part is too dark, that's when we need to start introducing flash. But using flash for split level photos makes it more complicated, and it's quite difficult to do well. And there's a few reasons for that. But the basic technique then is that we would use our shutter speed and our ISO maybe a little bit to expose for the sky, and then we'll adjust our flash powers to fill the underwater part. And typically, because we're shooting with a relatively closed aperture, the strobes need to be on pretty high powers. So you don't get anything for nothing in that respect. But this is obviously an important technique when we have, a big exposure difference between above and below the surface. Positioning those strobes is also really important. And I think the mistake that I see a lot of people making is they have those, they think, oh, right, it's a split level picture. If I keep my strobes in the middle, they're going to hit the surface. So I need to pull them down, which is correct. But the mistake people tend to make is they tend to pull them way too far down. And particularly if you're shooting over a seabed and you pull the strobes really, really far down, what they tend to do then is they tend to overlight the seabed and not actually light up your subject too much. So you want them below the midline of the camera, but not way down. I would sort of say, 4 o'clock, 8 o'clock type positions, but out a little bit wide, and generally on relatively high powers to get the pictures to work. I think another little technical tip I would say, just as I sort of try and wind this talk up, is that if you want the pictures, is that if you use a 45-degree viewfinder, 45-degree viewfinders typically have a rubber eyepiece on the top, or a screw-on eyepiece on some of the brands. I know Seacam has that. If you shoot split levels with that 45-degree viewfinder and the eyepiece on, it will collect water in the eyepiece and you won't be able to see through the eyepiece. So what you need to do is you need to just squeeze that rubber together, push it out to the side, and you can flip the eyepiece rubber off, and then it won't collect water and it's much easier to look through. I have to say, though, I use live view increasingly when taking these types of pictures. So I like to hold the camera out in front of me often and just use the screen. And with the focus fixed, that's actually a relatively easy way to shoot. So I quite like using live view when shooting splits. I would say about half and half viewfinder, half live view. Before I do the last few slides, if anyone's got any comments and questions, please fire them in. After the talk, I'll answer any comments and questions particularly either on split level photography or on underwater photography in general. So please send some in. And then I think holding the camera out of the water is actually, I think, one of the more bigger challenges of shooting a split level picture. And actually, the challenge of it varies depending on the location that you're shooting in. If you're able to be in shallow water that you can stand up in, particularly on, say, a sandy seabed like this picture here in Stingray City, in the Cayman Islands, this is a very easy place to take split level pictures. I stand on the seabed, I'm not wearing fins. I actually, as you can see in this picture, I don't shoot wearing a face mask when taking split level pictures. I'm wearing a hat and sunglasses, which actually is not for the aesthetic look. It's actually, this I find is the best way to shoot. The bright light there is quite hard to see through, so sunglasses help. The hat both protects my head from the sun, but also gives quite a nice shading when looking through the viewfinder. And this is actually a really nice way to shoot. You don't obviously need have my daughter on your back to take nice split level pictures, but we were able to take nice pictures on this day shooting in this way. So I don't wear a face mask if I know I can stand up, because I can just see through the camera perfectly easy. I'm not going to look around underwater. It's not a dive. I think that's one of the mistakes people make, is they think, oh, this is a dive, we need to go all divey and wear all that stuff. Wear what's right for the shot. However, and when you can stand up and shoot, it's relatively easy to make these types of pictures. However, there are limited places underwater where we can stand up and take pictures, and so most of the time we need to find another solution. When we're in deep water, and some of the pelagic encounters we have are typical of this, then it's a case of often swimming to keep the camera above the surface. And the key to this is not to push really hard with your fins, force yourself up and then sink back down, is actually just to maintain a nice steady swimming level. So you just slowly come up with the camera and you can hold a nice steady level at the surface and you're able to shoot. So it's just about that, sort of finding a nice rhythmic kicking so that you can push yourself out of the water. If you're planning to shoot lots of splits, don't wear a weight belt, don't weight yourself deeply. You want to be nice and floaty if you're going to need to swim to take the pictures. Quite a lot of big animal encounters that we can shoot at split levels are in baited situations where we're baiting sharks or crocodiles or whatever else it is to the boat. And in that situation, we can actually often shoot most easily split levels from the boat. And then because we're anchored on the boat, it's then relatively easy to hold the heavy camera half in, half out the water to take pictures. So shooting from the boat is actually quite advantageous. You often can't look through the camera when shooting, but with a wide angle lens, it's relatively easy to frame these sort of things up. I think the hardest type of split level shooting is when you're going out over a delicate marine environment, such as a coral reef, to shoot split levels. And then you've got nowhere that you can stand, and you need to still lift that camera out of the water. And that's when buoyancy is absolutely critical. And the photo this is the way we have to shoot split levels in the Red Sea. And the way we solve that is we all wear our wetsuits for the buoyancy they give, but no weight belts. We do it snorkeling, don't want any scuba gear weighing you down or anything. If you're going in for splits, you just go in for splits. And we go down, we ask the boat if we can borrow the life jackets. Every boat, as you'll know from every boat briefing you've ever heard, has life jackets. So why not put them to use? And we typically wear a life jacket and quite often use a second one underneath the housing to help lift it up out of the water. And that allows you then to float in very, very buoyantly over shallow coral and have the camera already half lifted out of the water for you. And it makes it much, much easier to shoot. You can see in this picture here as well, I've actually got those kind of Popeye big buoyancy float arms attached to my camera as well here, giving me additional lift. I'm doing everything I can to try and get my camera as buoyant as possible. The more buoyant the camera, the easier these shots are to take. But ultimately, with these shots where you're having to lie on the surface of the water and lift your camera out, they are physically quite hard work to do. And it's something to bear in mind when you're trying to take those types of pictures. The other thing I wanted to point out in this picture is how to get rid of those droplets. Now, there's quite a few ways that you can help minimize droplets on the dome port. When you're able to stand up, you can consider never getting the dome port wet in the first place. But a lot of the time we need to swim into the situation. And that's where having some sort of film on the dome port can help reduce those droplets. Saliva is a very common and easily available technique. Although I was just thinking in these current times of coronavirus, we do need to be careful where we're spreading our saliva around. So a more socially acceptable solution is to use some other sort of liquid. Mask cleaning, eye drops for mask fogging can work quite well. This baby shampoo can also work quite well to create a film on the thing. I'm a big fan of using potatoes. Again, relatively easy to find on most diving liverboards. Go to the kitchen, ask for a couple of potatoes, slice them up into thin slices and rub them on the dome port. And you can actually see the dome port just below me here. I can't point the right way on the camera. The dome port here. I've actually rubbed the top half of this with a potato before I went in on the dive. And this is at the end of the dive. And you can see already that still by the end of the dive, there's enough of a film on the surface that there's lots of droplets on the bottom half of the picture, which obviously when I'm shooting would be in the water, so it doesn't matter. But the top half where I've rubbed the potato is still creating a nice sheen. So if your dome port is covered in droplets and you need to clean them, the technique we often use as a photographer is to dip the dome port completely underwater, bring it back up, wait a second for the water to run back down, for the surface to steady again, and then shoot before the droplets start to form. And that's the other technique for avoiding them. And the potato does work well if you've got the chance to do it. But I would say, I think one of the things that I always find is if you don't need to get that dome port wet, don't get it wet. Going in to shoot split levels is a discrete activity. It's not something you tend to do at the end of a scuba dive. It's something you're going in the water to do. And if you're going in the water to do, particularly if you can stand up or you're able to get the flotation right on the housing before you go in, then the top of the dome port, you might be able to keep it dry all the way through the shoot anyway. And then you don't need to worry about these techniques. Right, that's plenty of talky. Let me go back to me being full screen and see if I can pull up some comments. So is that coming up? Thanks, Pete. Thanks for the support. Alessandra, is there any way to make good split shots with compact cameras, maybe some DIY domes? So this is a really, really good point, is that a lot of compact cameras shoot wide angle with an accessory wet lens that goes on the front of the compact camera. And the problem with that lens is that, first of all, a lot of them are designed not to focus on land very well, which can limit their ability for split levels. But the bigger problem is that you have to deal with a water surface on the front of the accessory lens and also between that accessory lens and the camera housing. And therefore, you've got these two meniscuses to deal with. A solution that a lot of photographers use is to find a thick rubber band. I'm kind of looking around my desk if I can find one, but you all know what a rubber elastic band looks like. Find a thick one of those, and you can wrap that round the back of the port where the accessory lens attaches to the port of your housing. And that rubber band can help keep the water in there. And then you can tip the housing backwards slightly, make sure that's full of water. And then when you lift it up, it stays full of water, and then you can shoot the picture. Again, the same techniques apply in that you want to use a fixed focus. You want to focus under the water and shut your aperture down as much as you can to keep the both halves sharp. And with that technique, you can take very nice split levels with them. You can also use DIY domes. And actually, the winner in the UPY compact category for 2020 was a split level shot using a dome port on a compact camera. And it's a great way of making your compact picture stand out from everyone else's, because most people struggle with split levels with compact. So if you're a competition photographer, it's a really good technique to use. Okay. Thanks, Pavel, for the support. Mero, thank you. The immortal question for you, Redomes, is what does Alex Mustard do to avoid droplet formation on his dome for split level shots? Thanks in advance. Well, one thing I do is I'll try and use as big a dome port as I can all the time. A big dome port helps in two ways for shooting. First of all, the bigger the dome, the easier it is to control that meniscus of the surface. And actually, really big domes create a really pleasing, often sort of sinusoidal shape of the meniscus that looks really attractive in the pictures. The other thing that they help with actually is they help a little bit on the optics, and I won't get into that in such a short talk. But the bigger your dome, the better. And I did happen, in case anyone asked, I did have my biggest dome here to show you, and it's a bit of a whopper, but yeah, there you go. A nice big dome port. You probably can't hear me now. A nice big dome port like this, I think works pretty well to help control those situations. And it's on the floor now. Yeah, but yeah, so that's a big one. Unfortunately, this is a bit big to travel with. So I have a medium-sized dome that you saw in the slideshow earlier with me with EZO on my back. That's my medium split level dome. This one was made by myself and Peter Liddell in the UK, and the medium sized one is made by Matty Smith in Australia, who makes some really nice domes for this. Right. Alessandra again, I have some wet wide lenses, but it's difficult to manage splits. Okay, that's exactly what we talked about. Advice to minimize flare. Particularly if you're using these bigger domes without shades, they can be a problem for flare. So that is an issue. I think a little bit of flare in a kind of J.J. Abrams style isn't a bad thing in a split level shot. I think I quite like that the seal shot I showed against the sun. I quite like the flare from the dome in that picture. It gives it a nice sort of iPhone flare Instagram atmosphere that I quite like. So I'm not too worried about that. Flare from the strobes, you need to keep those strobes pulled back. And that can be a problem if you're working with strobes. Richard, what do you find the best way to keep droplets off your dome port above the waterline? Don't get it wet in the first place. If you can, I realize that's not always practical. Then it's a case of finding something to create a film on there, baby shampoo, licking the dome port, saliva on the dome port, potato, that sort of thing. Then dip the dome port and get all the bits off that. Obviously your saliva, I'm sure, is completely clean, but if it's potato, you might have some bits. And then if you are continuing to get bits, dip before the shot, come up, let the meniscus settle, and then shoot before the film of water breaks up into the beads. Ultimately, they don't stress about it. It's far more important to have a really compelling image and have to Photoshop out a few droplets than it is to have a boring picture with perfect droplet-free surface. Is there an optimal port diameter? So because I use a lot of, this is quite an interesting question, Mark, in that because I use a lot of water contact lenses now, I quite often travel without a dome port for normal underwater photography because I'm using WACP for wide angle and Nikonos RS13 for wide angle shooting. And so when it comes to split levels, I quite often now travel with a large acrylic dome port specifically for split level photography. And it's actually quite light, but the bigger the dome, the better. It's always the bigger the dome, the better. So the biggest dome you can get your hands on. But it's quite, if you do a lot of split level photography, it's worth these days considering having a specific acrylic non-diving, because the big domes aren't designed for diving. They're waterproof, but they're not designed to go deep. Non-diving dedicated split level dome. And it's quite a nice thing to have actually. And they're not too, although they're quite big, they're not too much of a travel burden because they're actually very light. And I just wrap mine in bubble wrap it in a wetsuit, and it goes in a soft bag, and it's been fine on all the trips. So thanks, Jake. Well, it's needs must. How am I doing on time? Oh, 5 minutes. Right. Thank you, Ellen. Great and to the point. Really love these talks. Underground saliva movement. Yes. I must admit that my face mask has been defogged recently with saliva. So make sure you socially distance from me if you see me diving anywhere. Strobe position underwater. So I covered this in the talk, but the main thing is don't have them too deep if you're working over a seabed. If there's no seabed, it does less critical. But you want them obviously below the waterline most of the time, or typically you want them below the waterline, but not way down. So that kind of 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock positions is pretty good. You want powerful strobes. You want diffusers on them to soften and spread the light. And you want them pulled back a little bit to give them time to soften and spread because you're often quite close to that underwater subject matter. There are occasions, particularly in shallow water and river work in particular, where I sometimes do split levels with the strobes above the surface and actually creating an above surface. So they're actually out of the water and shining down through the surface. And this can be quite a good way of reducing backscatter in very turbid river conditions, but typically underwater. Yep, very good suggestion by Chris, who's done a lot of amazing model photography, particularly, and some amazing split level photography. Well worth checking out, everyone. Safety sausage under anything you can to get that thing floating. Ultimately, if it floats, it's a great thing to use. It's amazing what needs must. I have to say, although we don't encourage, we want our dive boats to have reusable plastic as their water bottles and drinks bottles on them. Actually, soft drinks bottles can also work very well if the boat's using them. You can get those bottles and then just tape them onto your camera rig to give yourself some temporary super buoyancy when shooting splits. But yeah, anything that gets the camera going up, good advice. Thanks, Sean. Really enjoyed that. I love trying splits. 4-inch dome can be hard work. Yes, you can shoot a lot of frames. Is a good way to control the meniscus, but also seek out those calm conditions. When the conditions are really calm, you'll be amazed what you can do with the small domes. And actually, I've had people on my workshops who've not had a big dome on that particular trip say, right, I'm going to go and take a good picture. And many times I've had people take really, really amazing split levels with a 4-inch dome. It's much harder than using a big dome, but it's definitely can work. Jess, do you have a picture of strobe positioning? Still keep them back behind the housing? Yes, indeed. Back behind the housing, down below, if my face is the dome. So instead of having them in their normal 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock positions, just down a little bit and then back a little bit. But they often need quite a bit of power when using them. But do remember that in a lot of situations, split levels of shallow water pictures, you don't need those strobes. So ask yourself really clearly, do you think I really need them? Thanks, Duxie. When you want them above water. Generally, above water, I find that my strobe arms are limited by how much they can hold up. So if I am planning above water strobes for a split level shot, particularly a river situation or a swimming pool situation, first of all, it makes the camera much harder to lift out of the water. So it's something that I tend to do when the camera's maybe going to be resting on the bottom of a river or something like that in very shallow water. When I'm lifting them up, often it's a case that actually what you need is you need the strobe arm directly below the strobe. Otherwise, it tends to flop. So it's more a case of the practicalities of it, but up in a kind of a rabbit ear situation, creating that pool of illumination, the same way that rabbit ears lighting works under the surface. But actually, the positioning is usually dictated by having to actually physically hold them up. And that requires the strobe arm to be pretty much straight underneath it. If it's on an angle, it tends to flop to the side. Right, how am I doing on time? Okay, last couple of minutes. Yep. The WACP is fair for split. So the WACP1 is designed as an underwater lens. It won't focus on land. It's not an ideal tool at all for split levels. You will struggle to get the above water part sharp. I've never even tried it. Although that said, there might be a situation where you're quite happy to have that above water bit not particularly sharp and you can still make a picture work. The WACP2 is usable for splits, but the problem with it is it weighs a ton and therefore it's very hard to lift out of the water. And also, although it's got amazing optics for underwater photography, those amazing optics of the WACP2 don't give you any aperture advantage for shooting splits. So they're no worse than a dome port, but no better than a dome port. Whereas underwater, the WACP2 is way better than a dome port. So if it needs must, you could probably get away with it, but it's not you wouldn't go to it for shooting splits. And as you know as well as I do, Duxie, we tend to on trips plan around split shooting, and if we're going to the point of leaving our dive kit behind, we can put the right lens on the camera too. Which lens? I didn't cover lenses because it's quite a big subject and I was trying to keep the talk down a little bit. So it's a very good question. The wider the lens, the easier it is to create a split level image. So fisheyes and ultra wide angle rectilinear lenses are the way to go. And because you're going to be shooting the aperture way shut, then you can get away with both. I use both and I show pictures from both fisheyes and rectilinear wide angles. When you start using the really big domes, and Matty Smith actually has done some really good, I think, groundbreaking work on this, you can actually start using longer lenses behind them. When you use a really big dome, it controls the meniscus to such a point that you can actually start using longer lenses. And that's, I think, a really interesting area for split level photography to go forward, is playing around with some of the longer lenses and creating different effects using that split level type image. And I think there's a lot of potential in that for underwater photographers. Right, I'm hit my 30 minutes. So I'm just going to whiz through these. Hi, I'm struggling to pronounce your name, but greetings to Malta. I would love to get back there again. Which dome for is better? I don't think there's a big difference between acrylic and glass. You do need to be careful with some of the things that you might use to keep the droplets off the different materials. So just be aware of that. Saliva is not going to hurt either, although it might hurt your buddy with our current situation. But I actually use acrylic domes for most of my splits now because I'm taking lightweight, large domes specifically for those shots. Viva the Spuds. Any tips for the waters, particularly dark and dirty? Challenging one. I think when it's dark and dirty, and you might need to use flash, and when it's dirty, you're going to get scatter. Strobes out of the water can help, but very hard to do, particularly if you're swimming. Can work in rivers. But I would also say there's an element of that maybe it's a little bit too difficult to shoot in those situations. Oh, I'm getting a stream warning. Hopefully I'm still online. I'm going to wind this up soon. Grim Pond. Well, maybe in shallow water, then Jenny, you can be out of the water. Thanks, Phil. I'm just going to whiz through these last comments. Tripod splits, really good suggestion. And, tripod or a monopod can be a good way of holding the camera at that split level position. I've never tried it myself. Fishbowl domes. Yeah, if you're really good at making them, it's quite easy to find big acrylic domes for sale online, and they're very cheap. But be aware that it's going to put a lot of torque on the housing with the buoyant weight of that dome in the water. So going to someone like Matty Smith, who knows how to make them properly, is better than trying to make it yourself if you've got my talents in that department. Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, John. Right, I'm going to try and get to these. Last few. Maybe another topic just for how to get under both in focus. Yeah, that's earlier in the talk. And I'm going to wind this up now because I've gone over 30 minutes and it's my lunchtime. So thanks for watching. This will be available online on here, and I'll also get it up on YouTube so it can be found in the future because stuff on Facebook tends to disappear. Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad it all worked.